I forgot to mention one part on learning here, and that's the insight learning. And this is a very interesting area of thought. Uh, there are many animals that cannot problem solve. They keep doing the same thing again and again and again. Now, there are some animals that can see the problem and uh, solve a problem without being able to have the prior experience. So, ravens, sea otters, chimpanzees, even some octopuses, will be able to do that. So humans are not alone. Oh, some sea mammals like porpoises and dolphins can do this as well. They basically, scientists were able to show this by tying a piece of meat on a string. Ravens will eat the meat if they can get to it, but they can't sit down or hover and get to it. So what they found is some of the ravens, without learning how to do it, would figure out that if they perched on the stick, held down the string as they were pulling up until they got to their prize, they can do this. A lot of these um, tests are quite interesting. If you've ever seen an octopus video where they do these odd feeding patterns, they'll put a crab, one of the favorite foods of an octopus, in a submerged peanut butter jar. And the octopus can see its prey, but can't get to it unless it figures out how to work an inclined plane or a screw top and get out of there. Octopus are very, very good escape artists, and there's many different stories about how interesting they can be with escaping from places. So this insight learning is a very interesting, a higher consciousness kind of idea that some animals have, especially in the vertebrates, but then we have octopi that can react that way too. Okay, I'm going to talk about some of the basic behaviors that we measure with animal behavior. And one of them is communication. Basically, communication is something one animal does that influences another animal's actions. So we have a sender and a receiver. There are a number of different ways to do this, and one of them is chemical. Insects do this through pheromones. They can set off pheromones that'll actually cause the eggs to be to develop differently, either into queen bees or workers or drones or what have you. And we can have different reactions based on the pheromone signals that animals or ants will send out. They'll bump into each other and they'll pass along the signal in a very crowded colony, almost like a wave. So it can spread very quickly. Cats will do this too. Here is a cheetah marking its territory. Dogs will do this too. They'll spray it not just with urine, but also pheromones from scent glands they have near their rectum. And then the other animals will smell this and realize, oh, hey, this is somebody else's territory. Sometimes they'll mark their territory, especially when they are in mating season or fertile. And then the other cats will know they would be receptive to mating. The way they have the ability to identify these smells through something called the VMO, or vomeronasal organ. And this is something, a set of sensory or smell receptors that are aside from everything else and all the other receptors in the nose, and connect directly to the hypothalamus. Now, that means the hypothalamus is, again, controlling our actions through our thoughts or actions towards one another. Um, for the longest time, we thought we were one of the few vertebrates that didn't have it, but it turns out we may have it. There's another facial nerve that goes directly to the nasal cavity and it connects directly to the hypothalamus, and we have some indirect evidence of a VMO or VNO. Um, and one of them is that women in the same household over time will have their menstrual cycles kind of sync up. It isn't like they have a digital clock that they sync their cycles to. It is some kind of chemical that their brain is detecting and controlling through the hypothalamus their ovulation cycles. On top of that, there has been studies showing men pictures of women and having them rate whether or not they're attracted to them. Then they have them smell either a, a PBS or a phosphate buffered saline solution or one with the swabs of armpits of women. And then they measured whether or not the women were in their menstrual cycle, the fertile part of their menstrual cycle. They found that the males were more attracted to those people, picture or no, that had were in the fertile stage of their menstrual cycle. So there is some suggestion that we are putting off these pheromones, whether or not we can measure them or not. It's very difficult to do that. Um, that our bodies are able to react to or detect and react to through the hypothalamus, which is interesting on when you get to Dr. Golaski's talk, or maybe it's called a rant, on that um, all of human love is basically a chemical reaction. I'll leave it up to you whether or not that is the key, but it's something that we're just starting to get into and really start to understand. There is the verbal way of communicating, which is much more effective. It's faster, uh, works day and night. It doesn't get washed away, and you can put more information in it. For example, these monkeys or primates, not no, those are monkeys, will have different calls to warn for attacks from the sky or from the ground. And you can see through the frequency and the amplitude of these signals. This one is clearly to have the monkeys react and watch out for eagles. The other one is to watch out for leopards, which is a complexity. When you think about all the nuances that we can put into our voices or accidentally put into our voices, that's also something that's interesting. Now, when we put in the visual, this is where it gets very interesting. We have visual displays in that have turned into genetic components in birds, where the males are very colorfully plumed, where the females are not, just so that the males can attract a mate. And I am not going to comment on the human version of this. However, a really good example that's safe for everybody is fireflies, arthropoda class insects, where they have this luminescence. It's called bioluminescence, and it's a fascinating study that I do not have time to talk about. But basically, it's like having a nitrous oxide boost to your butt, and it causes this glow. Now, we thought that all fireflies were made equally. However, it turns out that many different subspecies of these fireflies will have different signaling patterns, such as a long squiggle or a flash, a bounce, a flash, or a complex long light up or dots or a number of dots with their flying. This can signal the specific type of lightning bugs so they can mate. So even with this light display or visual display, they can transmit a number of very important pieces of signaling to a potential partner. Now, this is not the only way of communication. There's a lot of tactile information. A good one to use an example of this are honeybees. A lot of insects that live in colonies have a tactile sense, but honeybees are no exception. They do something called the waggle dance. And for those who are in the apiary science, there is more to this. There's also pheromones, but they do this little dance, and depending on how much off of an angle on the comb they have, and they can tell a lot of information to the bees paying attention to them. They're basically telling the rest of the bees where there is some sweet, sweet nectar that they can use for survival. So, depending on the angle, that tells them how far away from the sun they are on angle, and then how long they waggle tells them roughly how long they have to fly to get to that flower. It's a very complicated system, and it actually works, and we've been able to translate it to some extent. So it's quite fascinating. Now, I mentioned before that there's a communication aspect, or a tactile aspect to human interaction. And it turns out, yes, we will love our babies more than anybody else. And it turns out it's a smell and a sound and a tactile sense. Um, but also, we found out that giving skin to skin contact to the immediately born babies with their mother, it gives them a higher chance of survival. And we can measure that by they give them a healthiness chart. Immediately when they're born, they're going to look for how much they're moving, how much they're reacting to stimuli, basically how much they're screaming and moving about, and the color of their skin, showing oxygenation. And they found that there is a better score, a higher score, when they have direct contact with the mother right away. And this is good for the mother too, after such a traumatic time of birth. So the skin to skin contact is important, and also this enhances our hypothalamus control of protection. Mothers will um, react and nurture their kids or children, infants more, and have a stronger reaction when they're having more contact time with them. Males will have more of a protective reaction to their children. Um, this is a very, very strong reaction in humans, speaking from experience here. Um, it actually colors our emotional response to outside information as well when they're imagining their own child in those situations. Okay, I wanted to finish off by talking about how these actions and communications and overall behaviors can affect survival. And we talk about survival and passing on the genes as fitness. Those actions and behaviors that can make uh, one set of genes more likely to be passed on is called fitness. So, some of the ways fitness can be measured is by having a better territory or a larger one. And that means you have better access to food, water, less predation. The only downside is that you have to fight to keep your territory. And usually that means that somebody's going to be damaged up to and including death due to fighting. So, in those categories, a lot of the time there is an alpha male or alpha female that does all the fighting, uh, and may be damaged, but they usually have first dibs on mating and spreading their genes around more than anybody else. But the entire pride or pack or what have you survives better in general because of fighting for that access to food or water. And this is a really important concept because in a survival situation, you do not want to spend a lot of energy traveling or looking for food or water. You want to be able to be in the best shape you can for reproduction and survival. And longer time surviving means more times for reproduction and more of your genes being passed on. So it's really a measurement of how much energy it takes to collect food and survive versus how much energy you're ingesting. So foraging is an important part of territory, which means behaviors that will increase the spread of your genes will help you with territory and foraging. A really good class and a depth of study into this is primate behavior, and that's in anthropology, taught by Dr. Ned Farley. There is one aspect of animal behavior that is very interesting: altruism. Basically, altruism decreases the individual's reproductive success, but helps the whole as well. So it's not the one or the few, but the whole that succeed. And a good example is insect societies, where one queen is doing nothing but reproducing and producing all these eggs underneath her, and everybody else works to make sure that she survives, takes care of her, and defends these eggs. So overall, they have a huge colony and genetic success. Nobody else will reproduce. Um, uh, the the idea of fitness in this case means that either your genes are directly passed on in direct selection, or at least the very close kin genes will be passed on. And sometimes what they'll do is do this reciprocal altruism. I'll help you, and then you help me when it's time for reproduction, as in cousins or uncles and aunts in this case of the people who are having children will help raise the young and make sure they survive, so that their very close related genes will pass on. And then in that colony, when it's the other person's turn, or that uncle or aunt who is going to be reproducing, the current parents will help them raise their child. So overall, the colony or the pack will survive better. The whole idea here of altruism is um, the good of the many over the good of the few or the one. And if you do not know this reference, this is from The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek II, one of the best movies out there outside of Casablanca. This is a very touching scene, probably Captain Kirk's or William Shatner's really best acting ever in his career, which is, well, that's a low bar, but Captain Kirk and Spock, who gave his life for the many. And with that Star Trek reference, we are done with animal behavior.